Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Hello everyone. Let me introduce myself. My name is Aulia Rahma Putri, and then my student number is 220141610. Here I would like to present about my final project submitted in partial fulfillment of the requirements for the degree of Sarjana Pendidikan in English. My research is that with the title of an additional meaning analysis in Jacinda Ardern's speech. Here, before we go to the point or to the explanation, I would like to present about the content of the presentation today. The content or the presentation consists of 5 chapters. First chapter or chapter 1 consists of 3 parts. For the first part is the background of the study. The second is that the reason for choosing the topics. The third is the statement of the problems. Meanwhile, the second chapter consists of 3 parts. The first is the previous studies, and then the second of all is the review related theories, and the last is that the theoretical framework. Meanwhile, the third chapter consists of 2 parts. The first part is research instrument, and then the second of all is the procedure of collecting and analyzing the data. The fourth chapter consists of 2 parts, that is the result and discussions, in the form of first types of transitivity process and found in the speech, and then the second of all is the functions of transitivity process in the speech. And then the last is that the chapter 5 consists of conclusions and suggestions. Okay, so for the first one is that the background of the study, the first part of the chapter 1, background of the study. So language, according to G in 2011, stated that language allows us to do things because it allows us to participate in any kind of situations. It allows us to be things because it also empowers us to involve in any kind of social situations or social contexts or social personalities. Meanwhile, one of the form of the language is that the spoken language. And then this spoken language is usually used by all of the people, commonly used by all of the people every day, by everyone, anyone, everywhere, even like in any time. So one of the form of the spoken language is speech, right? Speech as the spoken language is one of the world leaders' methods to get the power to tell people what to do and how they live. Okay, so the leaders and the public figures who have the power, they usually use the speech itself. According to Balog in 2019, stated that politicians use language to communicate their ideals, demonstrate their authority, and also influence the public. Because politicians usually deal with the public, with the people, with the community regarding to the public policy, for example, and then public's aspirations. And here, Jacinda Ardern is one of the prime minister and also the public figure who has got a lot of spotlight as the female representation. She is female representation of a leader. She is the prime minister of New Zealand, and now she has become a female politician leader from the New Zealand Labour Party since 2017. So, background of the study is that I would like to analyze about the Jacinda Ardern's speech as a leader, as a influential figure to know about how she used the language in order to um, influence other people, and then her agenda. So for the next part is that the reason for choosing the topic. So the first reason is that because of the researcher's interest, that is me, in my interest into this figure, as Jacinda Ardern not only become the Prime Minister of New Zealand, she is also an individual. She is also a wife, a mother, and then politician leader, and she is also an inspiration to other people. She has got a lot of spotlight, and then because of her quick reactions, her quick response to the Christchurch tragedy, for example, and then how she managed to solve or to find the solution for the COVID-19 pandemic. Like, she also concerns in the women empowerment, globalization, and anti-racism. She is such a huge, female leader, politician, female leaders in the world as one of the representation. The second reason is that because the researchers' interest in analyzing the speech using the discourse approach, particularly in this case, is the ideational meaning under the framework of the systematical functional grammar. The third part is about the statement of problems. So there are two problems here that the researcher found or composed. Is that the first, what types of transitivity processes are used in Jacinda Ardern's speech in the general debate of 73rd session of the General Assembly of the UN delivered in New York, 28 September 2018. The second is that the what functions of the transitivity processes are used by Jacinda Ardern in her speech. Okay, so we will move to the second chapter. That is, the first part is the previous studies. So the researchers brought three studies here. For the first one is the study by Abrafi Ajay, Lawrence Ewusi, and Mensa Hariat Oko in 2015. So here they examine or they investigate about how former Ghanaian President John Evan Atta Mills employed language convey his uh, to convey his message to um, use the language in his first State of the Nation speech to communicate with his public or his people or his community. And then it turns out that the most dominant process here is the material process, and the function also reveals that how Mills and his administrative were the major actors of a series of demonstrations that happened in Ghana. And then so the first study it reveals the transitivity processes and also its function that has a similarity with the current study. And for the second study is a study by Wallach in 2019. He investigated the speeches by Senator Miriam Defensor Santiago. So Senator Miriam Defensor Santiago is one of the representative of a leader, female leader, and she portrayed the social issues, inequalities, and power abuse that happens in the Philippines through the transitivity process. It turns out that the most frequent processes are material, relational, and verbal, and they have their own functions to regarding to the politics and the problems that happens in the Philippines. So for the second study, the researcher also reveals the functions of the use of the transitive process. And the third study is a thesis by Ayuning Tias in 2020. She analyzed a speech by John Franklin Stephen, a man who was a representation of Down syndrome people. So here it turns out that the results show there are six processes involved in the speech, and they have the functions. Each of the each of the process have its functions, and um, it is also supporting to the current study of mine. Okay, so for the next part is that the review related theories. Here, for the theories, the researcher used the systemic functional grammar. So grammar basically it has three kinds of grammar. The first is the traditional grammars, and then the second of all is the um, functional grammar, and then the third of all is the um, formal grammar. So for the traditional grammar, it focuses on how the sentences are structured, and then for the formal grammar, it's focused on how the style or the structure of sentences. Meanwhile, the functional grammar it focuses on how the use of the words or the use of the language can convey certain message for its readers. That is why the researcher used this systemic functional grammar or the functional grammar. According to Gerard and Wignell, the functional grammars attempt to characterize language in use and are concerned with the use of the words to convey information. And there are three metafunctions or three meanings that exist in this theory. The first is a ideational meaning, the second is interpersonal meaning, and then the third is the textual meaning. So, for the additional meaning itself is about the interpretation of phenomena of things such as the living and non-living things, and then abstract and concrete things, and also the phenomena of events like what things are, what things do, and also the phenomena of about the conditions surrounded the events or the actions itself. Meanwhile, the interpersonal meaning are the meaning that are related to the speaker's views and judgments, personal views, judgment and views regarding to the text or the words. And then the textual meaning are the meaning that expresses the relationship between the language and the environment, both in verbal and non-verbal. So that is why the researcher chose the additional meaning interpretations, because the researcher is interested to study about how the use of the words can convey certain informations regarding to the text and context situation in the real life. And there is how we find the intentional meaning. The tool is the transitivity process. In the transitivity process, there are like six processes that involve. There is material process, behavioral process, mental process. The fourth is verbal process, relational process, and the last is existential process. So for the material process, according to Garrett, is a process that about you, the process that revealing or showing someone or something that doing something. So it's about the do activities, do action. Meanwhile, the behavioral process is that the processes relating to like the human's behavior, such as sleeping, breathing, sleeping, and then snoring, and then watching, looking, and to listening. Meanwhile, the third is that the mental process. The mental process is the processes that regard to three parts. The first is about the cognitive, uh, related to the how human thinking, showing the human thinking human thinking. The second of all is about the affections, and then the third is a perceptive, how human perceiving through their five senses. So yes, and then the next is that the verbal process is the process related to the saying process, saying action, saying, and like speaking, and then saying, and then yeah, that's the verbal process. Next, the relational process. In the relational process itself, it is about the process of becoming something or process having something, and particularly about the process of being something. That is the relational process, and then it is realized by the verb to be, and then have, has, possess, and something, so on. The last is that the existential process. So in existential process itself is a process that show or indicates the process of exist, and then it is usually realized by the word of there, blah 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 blah, and then the word exist, and then yeah, the word regarding to the existential process. So for the next part is the chapter 3, that is research instrument. Here, if we see in the PowerPoint, so I use this instrument. For the first one on the left, there is a table, and then there is a what is it? There is a code, R- RPI1, which is the abbreviation of the relational process identifying number one. So RP is the shortened word of the relational process. I is for identifying, and one is for the number of the clause. Meanwhile, under that we have like the sentences that is divided into certain clause. It is divided or into clauses, and then there will be a classification under the first table, that is my opening remarks as token, and then for the yellow one is as the process, what the name of the process, and then the participants or the circumstances that involve in it. For the second table, we have the summary of the table. So after I try to categorize and classify all of the data or all of the clauses that is found in the speech, then I would like to input the data into the table, like how many mental process that happen in the speech, how many material process that occur in this speech, and then I turned it into the percentage. Percentage and the frequency here, choose like to ease or to facilitate the researcher in order to find the most dominant process. Okay, so next we have the procedure of collecting and analyzing data. So for collecting the data, the researcher watches and listens to the video, and after that read, and or in order to understand and comprehend the written speech, because the transcription is already provided in the internet. So what the researcher do is that the researcher read and then do the triangulation sources. So in order to make sure that the transcription is suitable, or that is the exact what the speakers say, like the transcription and the video. And then the research data use the clauses that consist of 2,636 words. So those words are excluding the salutation, opening, and also closing remarks, because those parts are in Tereo Maori, and also those some parts do not have like what is it called? That do not have like some do not contain any kind of process. So we exclude that part. So for the procedure of analyzing, so after we got the transcription, the researchers break down the sentence says into the clauses, okay, like what I have mentioned before in the research instrument. So break down the clauses and then put it into the table. And then the researcher used the transitive system to classify or to categorize what process type that happens there, and then what the who or what the participants involved, and then what circumstantial elements that happen or exist in these sentences. After that, after putting to the table, the number of the classification will be calculated or was calculated by the researcher, and then the result will be explained into the fourth chapter, that is the discussion. And the last of all is that the functions, the researcher tried to reveal the functions based on the result that is found in the speech. Okay, so let's move into the chapter 4. The first part is about the types of transitivity used in Jacinda Ardern's speech. After analyzing the data, the researcher found that there are 278 clauses in the speech, and as you can see in the graph, the transitive processes found in the speech. There are six, or all of them involved in the speech. So the most dominant process is the material process as the 45.3%, and then the relational process as the 32.4%, mental process as 14%, followed by verbal process as 4.3%, existential process 3%, and the last is that the behavior 1%, that is the least used process. So the data itself was taken from the speech of Jacinda Ardern in the General Debate of the United Nations General Assemblies of 73rd session in New York on September 25th until the 1st October. Okay, so the functions of the transitive process itself, we have uh, each the functions of each process, and also the general functions of all of the speech. So for the first function, for the first function of the process is that the material process. So the material process, it turns out that have three functions for this process only. The first is to invite the people to solve the social and environmental problems together, which means like all of the leaders of the countries in the room. The second is to give a portrayal about her roles and how Jacinda Ardern reacts towards the international phenomena as a leader and a part of global community. And the third is to give an overview about the New Zealand's efforts, particularly in dealing with the domestic and international problems. So for the data example is that on the below. To invite other people to solve the social and environmental problems together is for the example like she said like we remain committed into the role of the SDGs alongside international partners through the significant increase and something. And then for the second part is to give a portrayal about her roles and how she reacts to international phenomena is that it is in the form of how she and New Zealand's efforts, like we will not issue any further offshore oil and gas exploration permits. So, and then the last functions to give an overview about New Zealand's efforts to deal with the domestic. So, for example, like the efforts, like yeah, we have set a goal of 100% renewable energy generation and etc. As we can see from the example itself, the material processes are realized by the verbs of we will not issue, we have said, and then established, and then remain committed to remain committed. And then the participant there is that we as the actors that represent Jacinda Ardern and her country, that is New Zealand. So this is for the first function. So for the next function is that the relational function, relational process. I'm sorry, the relational process. It has like four functions. For the first is to establish the New Zealand stance and identity in the international level. For example, like the data, we are a self-deprecating people, and then the second function is to describe the government roles. Um, it is stated in the some example. For example, like government do have obligations to their people and each other. The next function is to give an overview about New Zealand's efforts to deal with some issues. It can be seen from the third data, that is in New Zealand we have been always acutely aware of the phenomenon. And the last is to describe the urgency of the current global issues and the role of international community. So it can be seen from the example, the impacts of climate change are not academics or even arguable. From this data or example, we can see that the relational process are realized through the verb or through the to be, that are, we are, and then we do have the possessive relational process, and then we have been, that is the process of being, and then are not academics, are not. So the relational processes are realized through these verbs and to be. Meanwhile, the participant are we, and then the government uh, as the what is it? The attribute. Okay, and then let's go with the next process. We have the mental process. It is found that the mental process have four functions. For the first one is to strengthen the other leaders, that they have the collective order and responsibility by saying that please just think about this for a moment. So think is the process of cognitive. And then the second is to show about the ongoing phenomena, that is shown by the second data. We have seen ourselves as member of community. So have seen as the mental mental perception mental process. And then the third function is to show the environmental problems and future generation, for exactly like for example like and so amongst unprecedented global economic, and then growing sense of isolation, dislocation, a sense of insecurity, and direction of hope. The last function is to show her stance, or Jacinda Ardern's stance, as a representative of New Zealand in urging and supporting the current authority to take action. So, yeah, it can be seen from the fourth example, that is, we strongly support the Secretary General's reform efforts to make the UN more responsive. So basically, the mental process consists of three types. The first is cognitive, the second is affective, and the last is perceptive. And all of those processes involved in this speech. Okay, so for the next is that the verbal process. So the verbal process has a function to talk about the current environmental problems. We can take a look on the example that climate change was declared in the single biggest threat to security of the Pacific, taken into from the data 44. So the verbal process is realized through the verb was declared as the process of saying. Okay. And then the next is that the existential process. It has two functions. The first is to show the existence of the current challenges for the leaders. The second is to show existence of the Maori language used in the speech, as Maori language is the indigenous language or indigenous tribe in New Zealand. So the data or the example is that the first is there are generational demands upon us too, and then the second is in the Maori language there is a word. Okay. So the existential process is shown or is realized by the word or the to be are and is, and the word there is actually sometimes as the sign sign of the this existential process. The last process is that behavioral process. It has two functions. The first is to show the current environmental problems happen. The second is to show the government has listened to the youth's voice. So, for example, the data that's saying we need look no further than climate change. And then the second data, they are watching the sea levels. Then the last data is that we are listening and that we have heard them. So from these three examples, we can see that there is a behavioral process happen that realized by the verb need look no further than climate change from the word look, the verb look, and then they are watching. So from the verb watching, and then the next is that we are listening and that we have heard, listen and heard. Those are the part of the behavioral process verb. So those are the functions of each processes. Now we move to the functions of the general after the researcher connecting or relating the text and the context, uh, connecting the text to the context of the social context to the real context. So there are five ideas that the speaker try to bring, try to show, try to lift in front of the other people, try to, yes, bring it up. So the first function or the first idea is about the international cooperation. The second is the natural resources and environmental management. The third is about the equality. The fourth is the government roles, and the fifth is about the national unity. So, according to Poturak et al. In 2020, all these principles are bound together by the topic of global leadership and shared responsibility for peaceful, egalitarian, and sustainable societies. So, for these functions of the transitivity process itself, we can see that for the first is that the international cooperation. There are like the example of the data that shows the international cooperation idea. For example, like the first a period in New Zealand's history where we did not just observe the international events, and then also let's start with the institutions that have served us well in times of need and will do so again. And ultimately, it is up to us, the member states, to drive change at the UN, and this includes reforming the Security Council. So in this part, international cooperation that Jacinda Ardern would like to highlight is that on how she would like to tell the people in the room, to tell the other leaders, to tell the other representative of the countries, to bring or to build the communal cooperation under the international cooperation. Meanwhile, as the United Nations itself is the place for the countries to gather and then to talk to collect to solve the problems. So international cooperation can be done through this platform that under United Nation itself. And one of the ways that also to try to make a solution or to try to bring solutions through the United Nation as the platform, all of the countries to share their ideas, to share their solution, to share their problems. So this is the idea of the international cooperation itself. And then let's go with the next is that the natural resources and environmental management. Jacinda Ardern always often uh, stated about this natural resources and environmental management idea. For example, like how she stated we have set goal of 100% renewable energy generation by 2035, and then she stated all of the efforts that New Zealand and her has done so far to deal or to combat the climate change, for example, to make to make a better climate or environmental solution. And then the idea that she really lifts the environmentally idea, for example, from the example of that we can see on the presentation on the fourth example, the idea that we have been entrusted by with our environment and we have a duty of care. So this is the example that actually she really values the environment, because New Zealand itself is also located in the South Pacific area, and they really know what really happens during the phenomena in the ocean itself. She also put her concerns to the next generation, and it can be seen from the last example, that is the next generation after all deserves no less. So she, as the leader of the country, as a leader who have the power, she would like to show to the other leaders that um, a lot of efforts have been done and should be done in the future in order to manage the natural resources and environment, um, not only for themselves, not only for ourselves, but also for the next generation. So the next is that the equality idea. Here, Jacinda Ardern also brings the equality idea. We can see from the example that she said that in this modern age we have to recommit ourselves to gender equality. She stated that clearly. But we do, and I for one will never celebrate the gains we have made for women domestically. And then also from the second example, we can also see that she clearly stated that like a lot of issues that happen, social domestic issues, also international issues such as gender pay gap, overrepresentation of women in low paid work, and also the domestic violence. And the last is that she also brings the problem or the issues regarding to certain political stance, for example, like isolationism, protectionism, and then racism. So isolationism itself is the way on how a certain country or a certain party try to isolate themselves, or not trying to interfere to other countries or to help other countries. They just like would like to focus on themselves. And it also based followed by the protectionism that is done by the USA. The protectionism is a stance that they take in order to protect their own economical condition. So for the racism itself is the most what is the most the most brain phenomena, because all of people already know about how the case of George Floyd, and yeah, that has become the attention of the world. So she really puts her attention to that. The next is about the government roles. So she also mentioned about the government roles idea by stating like governments do have obligations to their people and each other. As politicians and government, we all have choices in how we respond to these challenges. And the last is that we are listening and that we have heard them. So the term "we" here has the reference to the government, or just in the Ardern as the part of the government. So yeah, she also tried to highlight these government roles, that the government has the role and duty and obligations to their own community, to their own people, um, in handling the challenges, in handling any kind of situations and problems, because the government have the power to do that. And then so the government have to listen to what the people that have chosen them to about solving any kind of problems inside the community. Next is that the idea of the nation unity, that is the last idea that Jacinda Ardern tried to bring. So it can be seen from the data example, that is, we are a self-deprecating people. We are not ones for status. We are the first in the world to do so. We are a remote nation at the bottom of the South Pacific. And aside from our history, we are also a trading nation, and probably so. So from those examples, we can see that the term "we" refer to Jacinda Ardern and her nation, that is New Zealand. She tried to highlight that she tried to introduce, she tried to build the identity and the stance of her country and herself there. So the term we is as the unifications term between her and her country. So there is no, so they become one. They become one entity, and then it is represented by the word we. That is why it's all about the nation unity. She is not becoming as a president. She is not becoming a uh, individual, but she is becoming her and her country. So, okay, for the last chapter is the chapter 5. Here we have the conclusion and also the suggestions. So for the first part is the conclusion itself. Based on the study, it can be said that the speech involves six processes of the transitive process, and the most dominant process is the material. And another, it is followed by relational, and then mental, and then for existential process, verbal process, and the last is the behavioral process. And it is also found that there are 278 clauses which contain the transitivity process. And each of the transitivity process has their own function. Not only their own each function, but also how these generally transitivity processes have functions, like the idea that is five idea or five functions. The first is that she wants to show about the international cooperation. The second about the natural resources and environmental management. The second is about the equality, and then the fourth is about the government roles, and the last is the national unity. And for the suggestions itself from the researcher, based on the study, would like to suggest that the following researchers continue the study by exploring into another aspects, as we know that the systemic functional grammar, it has like three meta functions, that is textual, interpersonal, and ideational meaning. So the researcher hopes or suggests that the other researchers can bring or can study this um, research or study this speech, but in terms of another um, meta functions or another meaning, that is textual and interpersonal. Okay, so I think that's all for my presentation. um, Thank you very much. I really appreciate for all of for all of the audience here. Thank you very much and see you. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.